Hello, thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. The planning committee members and the speaker today have disclosed no relevant financial relationships. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and log into our learning management system to complete an evaluation. Information on how to access this will be emailed to all attendees approximately 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Sigma repository within a few business days of recording. Following the presentation, if we have time, we will have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a message through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to the presenter. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A for questions and the chat feature to interact with other participants. We'd like to thank our speaker for sharing her expertise with us today. Our speaker today is Wendy Morgan. Wendy has over 25 years of experience teaching, training, and designing innovation learning platforms, along with extensive experience designing products and leading teams in development and sales. As a recipient of 5 grants, including one from the National Science Foundation, and in her current role as president, she has been able to expand her work in promoting cutting-edge technology that support great learning outcomes and that always include a focus on equity and inclusion. She has designed and developed virtual reality experiences as a powerful tool to improve learning outcomes. As president and founder of Shift, she is expanding her mission, delivering immersive training to nurses and nursing students on practical and soft skills, to address the most pressing societal needs of today. We are so glad to have you, and we want to welcome you, and we'll turn it over to you, Wendy.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Of course, I'm going to have the nerves right at first, but we'll get over those, even though I do these presentations all the time. So yeah, the company that I have founded is Shift, and we are a fully female-founded company, and we are defining the future of nursing education through the use of virtual reality. It's a very powerful tool, but I'm here to talk to you today about improving patient outcomes through a diversity, equity, and inclusion training. And we take a really different approach to this training, and pretty hefty, robust content today. So we'll dive right into it. On the agenda, I'm going to give you guys some new information, and then we're going to do some reflection, introspection with a larger group. Unfortunately, that's going to have to be on your own, but I do recommend you grab a way to jot some things down, because there's going to be some interactive content. In fact, we'll kick off with that. And then before the end, definitely giving you actions that you can take back and as of today, begin implementing in your work and your community. So these are the topics that we're going to be covering today. Really understanding what is bias. It's a term that's thrown around a lot, and having a clear understanding of it, the social impacts of that. And then we'll really narrow down and focus on the impacts of unconscious bias in the healthcare space, figuring out how do we identify that and our triggers for it, and then what do we do? So we are going to dive right in. Just one thing that we have focused on all along that is a really high priority for our work is that it is a personal journey. And that journey towards equity, it really begins with you. And then you have an understanding of where you belong and others belong. And it's our philosophy that if you are an agent of change, if you want to be, you must understand where you are on your journey before you can have a lasting and meaningful impact on the world around you. So I'm hopeful that we can all take a step on that journey today. So we're going to begin with an activity. So I'm going to tell a story, and this is where you can already begin to jot some things down, and I'll remind you partway through to jot these things down. So through this story, I'm going to throw in some characters. People that you encounter. Is very quick, not a long one. But when I do introduce someone, I want you to jot down some demographic aspects of that person, maybe age, gender, anything that you can think of. And I don't overthink it, just whatever pops into your mind when I introduce the person, then that's what you jot down. And then we'll take a moment at the end to reflect on that. So imagine with me, if you will, that you are traveling to a conference, and because we're imagining, you can pick whatever your favorite city, but you have to fly there. So you go to the airport, and hopefully your flight is not canceled or delayed, and you get on. And as you get on, actually the pilot is there to greet you and says hello, and then you head on back to your seat and you sit down, and the flight is uneventful, takes off on time, miracle of miracles. And then along the flight attendants. They come and they serve drinks and snacks, and then help you out throughout the flight, pick up your trash right before landing. So remember to be jotting down demographics of these people. So you land in your favorite city, and you're there a day early, so you get to go out to a restaurant at night, and you sit down at this wonderful restaurant, and behind you there is a couple, and they are there celebrating their 20th wedding anniversary. And that's a very fun event for them, and you get to say congratulations. And the next day you go to the keynote, and this is a tech conference because that's the field that I'm in. And the keynote speaker gets up on stage, and this is a founder and CEO that has started 3 high-end technology companies. And then from there, you go on to the rest of the conference and enjoy yourself. So hopefully you jotted down some demographic aspects of the pilot, flight attendants, and the couple celebrating their anniversary and the keynote speaker. Now, when we usually do these in groups where lots of people are talking, go back and say, all right, so who was the pilot? And typically we're going to have that pilot, most people have written down as a man, middle-aged, typically white man. Flight attendants, typically female, white female. The couple are typically a man and a woman. And the CEO, most often people think immediately male. Now, there is nothing wrong with making these assumptions. This is perfectly normal. It's part of what we're accustomed to in society. But on our work today, I wanted to really set a framework for recognizing that this is what pops into our heads, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we can do is raise awareness of why, and that we do make these assumptions, because we could go back and say it's a female pilot who is Asian. The flight attendants are Black male. The couple is 2 males, and the CEO would be female. And so those are different things that we're seeing now more often, and we need to recognize when we make an assumption that that's not what's going to be. So moving on. When you are doing this work, you really have to look in a mirror. And looking in the mirror does take courage. You have to be willing to truly look at what you see. But the other important piece of this is on this journey that you're about to take, there is no judgment, no failure, only learning. And that is what we're here to do, is we're here to learn together. So what is implicit bias? Or it is defined as the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. So that is the definition of this thing that we are dealing with. And as you can see, if you're not aware of it, and it is unconscious, and it encompasses a wide array of things, decisions that you make, it's something that's going to take some work, and that's what we're here to hopefully do together. So when we are in our workplace, in our life, we make snap decisions. We have to. We'll get into a lot of data around why that is. But these snap decisions, like the ones we might have made in the story, they can often be informed by implicit bias, because we use this implicit bias. And I want to stop for a second, because unfortunately, implicit bias has come to mean something very, very negative. And it isn't. It is just actually the way that our brains organize information and make sense of the world around us. Now, when that becomes a problem, it's when those decisions don't reflect our deepest held values and beliefs. And that can actually happen. You have a value, a belief, and you make a snap decision that doesn't align with that. Unfortunately, though, implicit bias can cause stereotype confirming thoughts pass through our minds spontaneously, and then that can lead to life-altering decisions, like many of the things we've seen in the news and some of the police shootings and other things that have really traumatized our nation and our world. So why do we need this tool, this implicit bias? Well, we get way, way too much information than we can actually process at a conscious level. If you think about just driving your car home, there's a bunch of stuff that happens, and you process it and you see a thing, and your brain says, this is what we do. And you're not even aware of all that going on. But without those shortcuts, we wouldn't be able to get through. So the human body sends 11 million bits per second to the brain for processing. Yet the conscious mind seems to only be able to process about 50 bits per second. So I'm not going to do the math, but you can look at those numbers and realize this is a tool that we're biologically designed to have in order to get through our world. And particularly now, we have little itty bitty bits of information coming at us continuously. And when you work in a high stress job like nursing, it gets even, those amounts of information get even higher. So what was I thinking? We are evolutionarily designed to rely on these shortcuts. We use it to interpret the world, mitigate threats, and they just keep us safer. I mean, you see us, you're out hiking, you see a stick shaped like a snake, you're going to jump. So those are the things that we do. But we have so much information flying at us that we can't process it on a conscious level. We would literally go insane. So we've come up with these shortcuts, and we put things into categories, and they help us sort the information into groups. Unfortunately, those groups can also sometimes be stereotypes. The nature of these categories or stereotypes can be negative and positive, which is why we want to disrupt their power to inform our behavior and actions in the world. Because when negative stereotypes bias our behavior, they can create harm for people on the receiving end. Some of the things that guide these categorizations can be based on incorrect information, and that's problematic. Because we are wired to find patterns, and once they're found and reinforced, they're extremely difficult to change, even if they're inaccurate and we are aware that they're inaccurate. So why do we make these assumptions? Well, in building patterns, our brain has created cultural templates of the world around us, and these are conditioned by a lifetime of experiences, including the families we were raised in, where we grew up, who surrounded us, and countless messages from the media. So here's how this can play out in, for example, a medical setting. So we have a colleague and a friend who is a nurse, and asked her one time, are you aware of a time when you made a split-second decision based on a categorization and the potential outcome was negative? And she said, yes. Unfortunately, she was working in the ER and two men came in. One was white, one was black. They had very similar symptoms. And she recognized in herself that she immediately categorized the white male as having a heart attack. And then the black male, she made an assumption that he was on drugs. And so luckily, she was aware of this split-second categorization that her brain made, and she effectively prescribed and helped with the treatment of the accurate to the symptoms. But that's just a small example of how you can make a decision and you're under stress, under pressure, time crunch, and you act on a decision that isn't fully informed because you're relying on these categorizations, and that can lead to negative outcomes. So I'm going to play a little video that talks to us about why we make these categorizations. And hopefully, I'm not seeing the play button, so hopefully this will play. Oh, it looks like my video is not going to play. Megan, I don't know if there's anything we can do on that.
One moment.
Sorry about that. So this video, while she's getting it called up, it's kind of a funny little video, and then it will allow us to see a more humorous side of that categorization and how we react to people who have sometimes differences from the way we view the world or the way we do things. And then we'll dive into the consequences of this. And if we can't get the video to play, then I can just keep talking. That's all right, Megan. Let's just go back to the slide. So in essence, the video is asking us to take a moment and think about what we would do if you encountered. Oh, is it play?
Our brain is hardwired to trust what's familiar and be suspicious of what's unfamiliar. It's a basic survival instinct that's helped keep us safe for thousands of years.
We unconsciously sort things into familiar versus unfamiliar, same versus different, them versus us. Here's a test. How do you feel about people who own a handgun,
Don't attend church.
Vote for the other candidate.
are on welfare,
Don't eat meat,
have tattoos,
Don't believe in marriage.
drive an electric car,
Didn't go to college.
don't speak English,
curse,
Are over 60.
are disabled,
drive the speed limit.
Love cats.
love dogs? Can you feel your brain sorting people into groups? Was there a little them versus us happening? It can happen unconsciously.
Thank you for getting that going for us. So yes, so those happen unconsciously, and in many cases, there's no negative outcome for not liking cat people or not liking dog people or not wanting to hang out with those other people. But then it can get definitely a darker side to this, and really understanding that every human is more than a category. And understanding that at a really deep level, not just saying the words, but really grasping why, how are they different, and then beginning to see the world from other perspectives. So it's important to realize that even though our brains are wanting to put people into categories, people are more complex and they have unique stories. And while not all of our assumptions lead to negative outcomes, often the categories we put people in can be harmful to them and to their health. And next slide. So this is a really good quote. It's from the New York Times, and it really sums up the issues that we're trying to address. So most people in healthcare, we're in this field to help and to serve and to look after the best interest of our patients. We're not aware of the biases that we have, and therefore sometimes act in opposition to what we believe and why we're even in this career. So the increasing diversity in the US population is reflected in the patients that the healthcare professionals treat. But unfortunately, this diversity is not always represented by the demographic characteristics of the providers, the caregivers themselves. And patients from underrepresented groups in the United States can experience the effects of unintentional biases that derive from these cultural stereotypes that we're talking about. And that can be on the patient side as well as the caregiver side. And this goes back to the categorizing people. So if a patient comes in and doesn't see anyone in their care team that looks or seems like them, that actually can lead to a level of discomfort and lack of trust. And it can really help and impact our healthcare system, including the patient and caregiver interactions, hiring and promotion, even interpersonal interactions within the hospital system. So it's our hope that we can help providers recognize the bias that exists. And thinking back to our nurse friend that we talked to, that can really begin to recognize these categorizations, these assumptions, these stereotypes before it can in any way impact or guide actions. Because we kind of want to think to ourselves many times, so these people on the news, these groups, unfortunately, they're becoming more vocal and prominent. This is where the problem lies. And that's a very visible and angry and uncomfortable view of bias. But in our work, we really like to take it back to not that negative side like that, but just the sense of belonging that we all need and deserve. And the fact that most often when a bias informs an action, it is unconscious, unintentional, and there was no harm that was set out to be done. So what are the impacts of bias in healthcare? So I'm just going to run through some stats really quick, and then we'll pause for a couple of questions. These stats you may or may not be aware of. They are a bit on the shocking side to read about. So here's the numerous negative outcomes on patient care. So as healthcare professionals, we go to work intending to provide the optimal level of care to every patient you encounter. But unfortunately, There's a really an abundant volume of research that attests that many groups of patients receive significantly lower care, and this is attributable in part to the bias held by the providers. Racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare can result from an interaction of multiple complex factors. So there's not just one thing, but that can include past and current discriminations inside and outside of healthcare, access, all these things that we're aware of, the social determinants of health. And there isn't a one size fits all easy fix, but there are steps that we can take. And this is the area that we've really chosen to focus on, is the caregiver bias. So there are poorer health outcomes overall for the minority groups. Some examples of how implicit bias plays out in healthcare include non-white patients receive fewer cardiovascular interventions and fewer renal transplants. Black women are more likely to die after being diagnosed with breast cancer, and non-white patients are less likely to be prescribed pain medicine. This one is really sad. So coronary heart disease is the leading cause of death among every racial and ethnic group in the United States. But communities of color bear a disproportionate burden, with little improvement in overall mortality rates and little improvement over the last 40 years, which is kind of shocking. And that accounts for 1.4 million deaths in the United States every year. And the American infant mortality rate for Black babies is twice that of white babies. A recent study showed that Black newborns are more likely to survive childbirth when cared for by Black doctors. However, when looked after by white doctors, they are 3 times more likely to die than white babies. And Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in a pregnancy-related death as compared to white women. And there are significant disparities in the outcomes of cancer measures, not just mortality, but incidence, prevalence, quality of life after cancer, treatment, screening rates, and stage at diagnosis. But it really doesn't have to be this way. I think, if we all begin to focus on the areas that we can address, taking this personal journey and then becoming advocates and being able to expand the work outside of our own community. Those are some things that we can begin to do. So I would just take a moment to pause. That's a whole lot of information that I've thrown at you guys and statistics. Were there any questions? I'm not monitoring the chat.
There are currently no questions in the Q&A, and the chat is, we were just talking about the tech gremlins that were preventing us from playing the video. So no questions at this time.
Wonderful. Well, hopefully the next video will work. So let's dive into how the world around us begins to influence our behavior. So back to, these snap decisions that we make, and about people and situations that are not reflective of our values. So there are external factors that also impact this decision-making process and can cause the bias to then inform our actions, which is what we don't want to do. So we're going to do another activity real quick, and I'll go very slowly through these slides, but this is where you'll need to jot down some answers to questions as we go through this. So your answers, again, I want these to just be spontaneous answers. Don't reflect too much on the answers that you give, and just be aware that your answers can be different for you depending on where you are, and then sometimes you may not have an answer. So NA is perfectly fine. So 1 is very comfortable, 2 is comfortable, 3 neutral, 4 uncomfortable, and 5 very uncomfortable. And so those are the way that you will rank each of these following situations. So I'm not going to read through these because I think you guys can all see them on your screen, but this is where you would rank each of these 1 to 5 using the scale that I just mentioned. 1 being very comfortable, all the way down to 5 being very uncomfortable. I'll give you just a moment to rank these. And then we're going to do another one. 1 being, again, very comfortable, 5 being very uncomfortable. And 1 more. Okay, so we're just going to think back through those. I hope I didn't rush you guys along too much, but I did just look at the clock, so I want to make sure to get through the slides. So just looking at those, where did you get the highest total? Is there an experience that one of these situations where you felt the most discomfort? When we feel discomfort around people, that's when we put them into that other category. And again, this is not something that you know, these were quick answers. So you didn't sit there and think, oh yes, I am uncomfortable with this person, but it's just a reaction that, again, it goes back to those cultural templates and the templates that we've lived our whole lives with. So when you put them in the others category, that category often manifests in a bias or an exclusionary behavior. So when you think about those situations or a situation you may have encountered, then think about why you might categorize them and how putting people in that other category can be have negative consequences. So we're going to bypass the next question slide and move on. So these exclusionary behaviors, they stem from embedded inequities in our society. So some of them are the choices that we make based on our cultural templates and our biases, but some of them are systemic and baked into the society as a whole. And because of that, then we have, really been fed the information that stems from those, and they guide our decisions and our actions without us being aware. And then there are systems in place that perpetuate these stereotypes, and they reinforce the unconscious processes. So when you think about social determinants of health, things like the location of the best hospitals where people can get the best care, you look at who has the best insurance. These are all things that are systemic and really baked into our society, but they continue to perpetuate this. And then that even goes outside of healthcare with access to good food, fresh air, clean water. So we mistakenly believe that stereotypes are always true because they are systemic and have been part of our society. But when they persist in our fundamental institutions, they marginalize entire groups of people, shorten lifespans, and reduce quality of life.
Wendy, can I ask you a question here from one of our participants?
Yes.
What about for nurses who experience bias from their patients?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
It does happen, and it is very unfortunate, and that is another area that we're hoping to begin to address. But oftentimes that comes from a misunderstanding, and I do not even pretend to want to say, well, do more work, because nurses have way too much. But when patients come into a situation where they feel unheard and misunderstood, and they don't feel like they have an advocate, then they may exhibit biased or exclusionary behaviors to their caregiver, which of course is counterintuitive. And unfortunately, more and more often now is leading to violent behavior, which is a whole other bucket to address, but it does go both ways. And, unfortunately, I can't train the patients. I would love to, but there are things you can do with the active listening and the advocacy and de-escalation tools that can often help meet in the middle between the different views. I hope that was helpful.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. So negative stereotypes do create winners and losers very clearly. The losers can be victims of senseless violence. And we have these few examples, and there are just so many more. And these are outside of healthcare. And, it's just, we unwittingly reinforce these set of social relationships and create this winners and losers when really it is a basic human right and need, like food and water, to feel a sense of belonging. And that sense of belonging is extremely important, and we need to overcome bit by bit, one step at a time, the steps we can take to begin to build that culture. So, all done with the negatives. So awareness, ironically, this tiny little thing that seems so small can be a huge step in the right direction. So now we do have another video coming up. Hopefully the gremlins are gone. But one way to really effectively begin to become aware is this tool called mindfulness, and not the meditation of mindfulness, but mindfulness as a tool for grounding. And so hopefully we'll get this video going. Looks like my embedding tool did not work again. Sorry.
You may have heard this word mindfulness. It's become something of a buzz phrase of late. So I'm going to give you one simple, serviceable definition, which is this. Mindfulness is the ability to know what's happening in your head at any given moment without getting carried away by it. Imagine how useful this could be. Just as an example, you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off in traffic. How do you normally react? I think most of us, we normally react by having a thought, which is, I'm pissed. And then what happens next? You immediately, habitually, reflexively inhabit that thought. You actually become pissed. There's no buffer between the stimulus and your reaction. With just a little bit of mindfulness, in that same situation, you might notice my chest is buzzing, my ears are turning red, I'm having a starburst of self-righteous thoughts, I'm getting angry. But you don't necessarily have to act on it and chase that person down the road, screaming at them with your kids in the back of the car thinking you've gone nuts. Now, you might be thinking, don't I need to get angry sometimes? Aren't I justified? I would say yes, but probably not as much as you think. The proposition here is not that you should be rendered by mindfulness into some lifeless, non-judgmental blob. The proposition is that you should learn how to respond wisely to things that happen to you, rather than just reacting blindly.
Okay,
And that, my friends,
the video there.
is a superpower. How do you get it?
So yeah, mindfulness, it's a noun. It's defined as the quality of state of being conscious or aware of something. So it's a mental state that's achieved by focusing on your awareness in the present moment, calmly acknowledging and accepting your feelings and thoughts. So we're not saying don't feel, don't react, don't have any of these sensations, but taking back the power over our own reactions and a strong awareness of our emotional reactions to people. And so when I think about the patient interaction, again, we've got stress, we've got external pressures we've brought to work with us, the things at home, being cut off on the drive. And it doesn't take a gargantuan effort to become aware or even to interrupt that emotion to action chain of behavior. So we just want to practice becoming aware of the emotions that we have in reaction to what other people are doing, and be in the present moment. So, and when you're in a moment with a patient and they do something potentially that's a trigger for you, when you bring in all your past experiences with similar patients, or your past experiences that you just had that day, and you let those inform and sort of meld with your current emotion and then react to that, then it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, we're human beings, so what happens with the person that you're reacting to, they then react back. And so then you've got this feedback loop of high emotions. And so by using this superpower of just taking a moment and recognizing that emotion, and it's just as simple as stop, breathe, and think. And it could just be a couple of moments, a couple of seconds. We can't take time out and go sit in a meditation moment when we're interacting with a patient, but it doesn't take much. So And I don't know if you've ever done this, but you've gotten very angry, maybe as a partner, a child, whatever, and just think for a moment yourself, have you ever just stopped for just a second and breathed and took a moment to really evaluate what was actually going on and try just a bit to think about where that other person is coming from, what might be triggering them to behave in a way that then triggered you, right? To get this feedback loop. But I would like for you to think for just a moment a time when you didn't take a beat recently, if you had a moment where you reacted. I'm in LA right now for working with the Cedars-Sinai Hospital, and traffic is interesting here. So I've had a few of those moments lately, and you want to react, right? You're angry, they did a thing. And how did you react? So with that moment in your mind of when you did just react, I want you to think, if you had stopped, identified the emotion you were feeling and the why, and took a breath, what might have been your reaction? And it might have been different than what actually happened. And this can be, again, personal. It can be a text you responded to or anything like that. But yeah, visualize, if you could have not reacted immediately, would your reaction have been different if you had paused to think about all the information? So the other piece of this is to be a bit preemptive. So to be aware of the things that trigger you, the things that potentially you've had a bad experience with, and they're going to inform your behaviors. And some of these are just like basic biological needs. So if you think about why you might react strongly to something, so maybe you already are feeling elevated, maybe you're hungry or tired, or there's something else that already happened that you're stressed. And I know I'm probably talking to mostly nurses here, so unfortunately that's a bit of your existence right now. But these are things that even exacerbate those even more. But then in our daily lives, there are times that we're more susceptible to decisions based on bias. These are times when we're triggered by a past experience, hungry, tired, stressed, and these are called vulnerable decision points. For healthcare providers, these can also include emotional states such as anger, anxiety, fear, and disgust, lack of concrete guidelines for decision-making, being distracted or pressured, long working hours, working at a fast pace and kind of unforgiving work environment, dealing with repeated crises, being backlogged, or lack of feedback. These are all things that can contribute to less of an ability to take that mindfulness moment and be in charge of the reactions and aware of your emotions. And unfortunately, the pandemic has just exacerbated all this so very much. So we'll talk about some conscious steps to disrupt the unconscious bias and decisions. So as I've mentioned before, nursing, like many other professions, this is one that draws people who truly care. They go into this field to help, to be of benefit, to save lives. So it's particularly hard to accept that unconscious bias can have a really negative impact on the very people where they're trying to help. So we're going to talk about steps you can take every day to overcome negative impacts. So talking about creating positive change. None of us want to see ourselves as biased, especially now that term has become so, has such a negative connotation. So we don't want to see our actions resulting from an unconscious stereotype or categorization, particularly, again, in healthcare. But it's a common and persistent problem. And unrecognized and unmanaged, it can lead to the health disparities that we've talked about and negative outcomes. But using some of these following strategies, they can offer a positive framework that you can use to help overcome this. So without acknowledgement of a problem that exists, no action can ever be taken. So when we talk about disrupting your chain of behavior, awareness is the first step. For this systemic problem, this one that is so persistent, it really takes acknowledgement, not just a thought, oh yeah, I see that happen, that doesn't apply to me, but true acknowledgement of when you see biased behavior and inequitable treatment. That's the first step. With acknowledgement becomes acceptance, and then acceptance of accountability and responsibility, and the responsibility to make a difference. You can become personally aware of your own implicit bias and begin to respond to patients in ways that fosters this positive behavior, empathy. And then the personal awareness is the process of looking inward to recognize your beliefs and values, and then use that awareness to develop self-regulatory behaviors and mitigate the influence on the patient interactions. So empathy is an interesting thing. So many people actually equate empathy with sympathy, and they're actually very different. Sympathy says, oh, I can relate, I've had that experience, and you think about self. But empathy is a way of looking at the other and their whole experience and where they're coming from, and not giving yourself over to their experience or embodying it yourself, but to really truly embrace where they're coming from. You can begin to empathize with patients and their circumstances in possibly new and different ways to better understand what they're feeling and why. You can develop this kind of empathy by making a conscious effort to understand the patient's situation and their point of view. And I know sometimes with patients, depending on the unit you're in, your interaction with them is fairly short, but the really beginning to that active listening, which in our course that we deliver, we talk a lot about the active listening, advocacy, courageous conversations. And there are little things that you can do to begin to understand what that patient is feeling. And we as human beings, again, along with categorizing things for information, another way that we survive is being self-focused, right? We are focused on our own personal survival and our own personal well-being. But caregivers, by nature, are focused outward also. So there's just that transition of really using the knowledge you have of your patient and understanding what their fears might be or their triggers. And then being the patient's advocate by assisting with communication with other members of the healthcare team, identifying treatment options, and ensuring that the patient's culture, history, and fears aren't overlooked. And then education, that's a big piece. And that's the area where I like to try and help and come in is it's both personal education and organizational education, because one person can begin to make a difference, one person can go on their own journey, but really the organization as a whole has to be willing to do the education. And it can't be one or the other. I mean, there's got to be a place to start, but ultimately the goal is to get the organizations to acknowledge these things and begin to make systemic changes. Some studies suggest that traditional training methods are actually ineffective, and some go so far as to saying that training programs can be actively damaging to some of these efforts. And part of that is because when you go into a class or an education where you feel like you're being blamed, and you're not doing your part, and it's not acknowledged that this is an unconscious and not a thing that you're choosing to do, you don't want to learn, you don't want to hear about that, because I know I keep saying this, but this is a caregiving field, a caregiving career. And so to have it thrown in your face that you're not doing your part is not the best approach. But being able to just have a broader understanding of the impacts and small incremental things that can be done is the way to go about it. So we have to understand that there are limitations to traditional diversity and inclusion training, which can usually be found in one of two areas. The failure to understand that cognitive biases are extremely difficult to root out, and the failure to recognize the need for ongoing education. So we just have to understand that it's going to take time and focus, and it's not going to be a quick fix. There isn't a pill to take for this one. So focus on becoming more aware of your thoughts. Focus on taking control of those emotions and changing potential behaviors that can come from a trigger or an unconscious bias, and then stop, breathe, and think before reacting. And I made it with plenty of time for questions, so I hope that we have lots of them.
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Wendy, for sharing all of that. I love the examples that you used where, getting the participants involved, and that's wonderful. We do have a question here that I want you to explore a little bit. How would you explain that these statistical differences in healthcare outcomes are indeed attributed to bias, exclusion, and stereotyping?
So the bias and exclusion, those things are a component, and those often, of course, are given at point of care. But the bias and exclusionary behaviors that influence patient outcomes actually are also outside of the healthcare setting. So when you think about particular cultures, there may be a fear of being in the healthcare system, and so therefore not seeking treatment. A lack of awareness that the genetics of particular ethnicities lend themselves more toward particular diseases. So information, knowledge, being out there in the public. Then there's also access. So those are all components. And the only component that, when we talk about education and organizational change, that's the point of care bias, where potentially, and in a split-second decision, a patient is misdiagnosed because of bias. And some of that goes back to the original medical research that has been done. So for women, much of the medical research early on was done on men's bodies to determine what women needed. And so women having a heart attack are often misdiagnosed because the symptoms present so differently. So yes, I am by no means saying that this is a very simple and one area of focus to fix it all. But this is an area of focus where we, you as caregivers, can begin to see an impact pretty quickly with some small changes. I hope that was a sufficient answer.
Perfect. Yes, because I think, another component of this question would be, what about the lack of effort among that category or that group of individuals themselves, or the outcomes that their lifestyle has brought them to? So I think you answered that quite well, Wendy. Is there anything else you would like to speak to in that regard?
Only just to say that when you look at a problem like this that is historical, systemic, ongoing, and huge negative outcomes, it can feel so overwhelming. And you can think, well, goodness, what is one action on my part going to do? But it's actually a phrase I know from adopting pets. But if you adopt a pet, that's only a small portion of your life, but it's their whole life. So when you translate that to this space, you doing one thing to change the outcome or the experience of one patient, even that would be enough, right? Because that's their whole experience. It may be one patient that you see out of many, many, many in your week of work, but for that patient, that's their one experience, and it's often very traumatic. So if you can do any small thing, that will have such a huge impact.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I think that truly does help individuals put it into perspective. Mm-hmm. How can we gently help people recognize when they are not aware they are being unconsciously biased against another? And I want to tag on to that question that Lillian said in the chat and ask, do you know of any good implicit bias assessments that individuals could do, or anything that could help individuals recognize those unconscious components?
Yeah, so there are things you can do, and I actually could do a whole nother hour on courageous conversations. But it is, back to that, the way that we approach this topic by making people not feel targeted or wrong so that they will actually listen. So just to potentially, you could present what the patient might have felt in that situation. and that could be a way to gently nudge someone to begin to recognize it. But if you wanted to look up courageous conversations, that's one. And then for the other piece, actually, yes, we actually have a tool as well, but the Harvard bias test is a pretty good one. You can go through it and it can really begin to help you recognize those areas that you could be completely unaware that that you have a bias in.
So I just shared the Harvard website in the chat so that if anybody wanted to take a look at that, that is free for use. Donations are accepted. Of course, Sigma is not associated with this, and we do not necessarily recommend it, but it is a tool that you could use. I also wanted to point out this Jane Watson quote that Angela posted in the chat. Perhaps this one person at this one time is why we are here. And I think that resonates with what you said, Wendy, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. That's a beautiful statement.
All right. We don't have any other questions coming in, but I don't know if you want to talk about maybe the upcoming Sigma Academy that Shift is working with us on.
Yeah, sure. I would love to do that. So this is a full course that we've designed and developed based on years of research, and it does go into much more of the reason behind belonging. And it does speak to what I've mentioned here in that in order to make a difference, I really move the needle on this, everyone has to be at the table and be willing to have the conversation. And when you make it a personal journey, and really allow people to reflect in private on their own behaviors and their own triggers, then that brings people to a place where then they're willing to more closely examine things, areas where maybe they've been making mistakes or maybe have not been acting in the most equitable manner. Because if you think about it, none of us want to be called out or like admit our mistakes in front of our peers or our supervisors. And then when you think about belonging, we go into the science behind the reverse of that, which is rejection. And it's really fascinating study around how our brain interprets rejection. Because, we came from the days of living in caves in groups, and that was the only way to survive. And so that piece of our brains is not gone. And so when you are rejected by the group that you are working with or trusting your care to, that your brain actually interprets that as a risk of death, and you can treat the pain of rejection with pain medication. So when you look at it that way, it's a fascinating study of why it's so important to make sure that people belong. And this, of course, in my dream world, would be very focused on making sure that the bias is not happening within the healthcare, within people that work there, as well as bias towards people who are coming to receive care. And and that's a particularly fraught situation because they are immediately vulnerable because they're ill, they're not well, and many times even people who have maybe been to the doctor their whole lives, not at a hospital perhaps, or not in this particular situation. So there's so much fear. And so really talking about all the components and the web nature of this work, as that's what we do in this course. And so we start high level and really just looking at the why, some of the statistics, and then over the course of the 9 weeks, we just dive a little deeper and a little deeper until, as one of our participants said, that it's the most comfortable and safe place to feel really uncomfortable that they've ever been. But then the culmination is spending time in someone else's reality. And that's a really hard thing to do because we want to always translate what we see and hear through our own understanding and our own perceptions. But by being in an immersive, a 360 immersive environment where you are hearing what the patient is thinking to themselves, you're on the other side of the table or the bed and receiving the care or the lack thereof. It's really an eye-opening experience to see the world from that perspective. And so, I really am passionate about this work, obviously, and love to see the difference that's made when people can feel comfortable to go on their own journey and then really begin to expand that out and begin to notice their own change in behavior and their own change in perspective and perception of other people.
Wow, that's truly lovely. I really do appreciate you sharing that. So I think at this time, we want to thank you, Wendy, for presenting all of this great information today. Sigma is grateful that you took the time to share with this audience, and we definitely look forward to hearing more from you in the future. We hope that you enjoyed this webinar. As a reminder, 1 week from today, we will email you a link for the evaluation so you can obtain your Nursing Continuing Professional Development Certificate. Be sure to check out Sigma's upcoming webinars and other resources to support you and your colleagues at sigmanursing.org. Previously recorded webinars are freely available on the Sigma repository. Thank you so much for joining us today and have a wonderful day.